Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war, not quite frontline update. This is an analysis on what's going up in Kursk and comparing that to Pokrovsk and other areas and seeing what the overall strategic operational objectives are for either side. We're going to talk about strategy. Remember, strategy is your overall approach to, how you're conducting this war, why you're conducting this war, and what your overall objectives are. An operational scale is looking at a region like Pokrovsk area and saying, right, okay, the town of Pokrovsk has this operational significance because of X, Y, and Z and their logistics hubs, and that will be useful for this kind of general area. And a tactical scale would be looking at say an area of the Pokrovsk region, saying, right, we need to take that hill there so that we can get views over that village, and we want to take that village, etc., etc. So the tactical feeds into the operational. Many operational outcomes will feed in possibly to a change of strategy or whatever. So there are these words that get smashed together, and I probably do it just as much as anyone, but certainly the media do this a lot. Phillips O'Brien has just written a piece showing how the media are doing an injustice to a military understanding of, say, Kursk, Pokrovsk, and what's going on along the front lines, because they say, well, this settlement is strategically important, and it's just, this equivocation over certain terms like strategy and strategic. Anyway, we'll get to that in a bit. But my position has been, I'm going to use Andrew Perpetua's map here because you can go back in time to just look at changes over time, which I think is going to be quite useful. My position is that there's a game of chicken going on, military chicken, whereby the Ukrainians had a choice. So let's rewind a bit. Okay, you have this war going on along the front lines in the northeast, in the east, along the south, and along the Dnipro River, right? Along all of these front lines, there are massive fortifications and minefields. And so I think the Ukrainians were building up forces, training these forces and equipping these new forces, and they had a choice, right? The overall objective would be to regain initiative, because if you're just going to sit on defense, then the Russians get to dictate exactly what you do at any point in time. And you are always reacting. You are not forcing the Russians to react, which means they get to dictate the outcome. You can't win a war if you are always on defense, if you always are reacting, if the other side consistently has initiative and momentum. So how do you wrest back initiative from the Russians? And I discussed this in my panel discussion on Silicon Curtain recently. So my position is that the primary objective of Kursk was to wrest back initiative so that the Russians were reacting to the Ukrainians. Now, why Kursk and why not anywhere else? They could not have achieved what they've achieved now had they attacked at any other place on the front line, because it would have been grinding positional warfare and they would have attrited a huge amount of their troops and material in so doing. So one of the metrics of success, we talk about different levels, or I talk about different levels of metrics of success, how we measure success. And it depends what your objectives are, and they have different levels of objectives. So in this case, wresting back initiative is their primary objective, but that fits into a larger objective of taking back their territory or prevailing in the war. Being able to have territory to exchange for their own territory, that's a way of taking back territory. So you can either talk about militarily moving into areas to physically take that area back by force, or you can force the opposition to give you back that territory because you have some of their territory, right? Two sides of a square. Okay, so the overall objective in this whole conflict is to get back their territory to 1991 borders. Let's assume that is their number one goal. Whether that's achievable is another question, but that's what they're going to be wanting to achieve. Now, under that, they have other objectives. I'm talking about the Ukrainians here because I don't think this applies to the Russians so much. One of the objectives underneath that is not to lose that many troops. Because they have a precarious number of people that they can potentially recruit to this war. they have fewer members of the population than Russia, so they need to be much more careful about how they use their personnel. And they have much less equipment than the Russians, so they need to be careful about how they use their material. So one of the objectives underneath the Take Back Land, and in this case, Rest Back Initiative, is going to be not lose troops. Another one is not lose material. And another one will be degrade Russian personnel and degrade Russian material. So not lose ours, lose loads of theirs. Okay, so those are some of the main objectives that fall under that. And then you'll have other objectives like logistical targets. Take out like the Sudzha railway line and get information on the railway network, and have this kind of gain and that kind of gain that will also sit below the Rest Back Initiative. So there'll be other sub-objectives underneath there that the Ukrainians will be wanting to achieve, whether it be in Kursk or anywhere else on the front line. So the question is, how do they Rest Back Initiative, take lots of land, because that's going to be another one, not lose as many troops and material, and attrit Russian troops and material, and achieve certain kind of, and I'll use strategic objectives in a non-military way. Like it's very useful to have control over the Russian railway area in this, you could say, an operationally significant logistics gain there in say Sudzha or anywhere else on the front line. So where can they do that? They cannot do that in a single place along the existing front lines inside Ukraine, because they will lose huge numbers of their own personnel and material by attacking fully manned Russian trenches where the Russians are prepared and they've set loads of minefields, and there are drones flying everywhere to give good reconnaissance, ISI, intelligence surveillance reconnaissance, on your movements. You can't surprise around here. Anywhere along this front line, you can't surprise. And the other thing is, if you attack into a Ukrainian position, then you're going to have bombs and missiles and all sorts of stuff obliterating that area from both sides. Would you rather that happened in Ukraine, where you have to pick up the pieces and pay for the reconstruction of all that area? Or would you rather that happen in Russia, where the Russians would have to pick up the pieces? Okay, so the calculation would be, for me, that the only place you can attack and gain all of those advantages and achieve those objectives is inside Russia, where the Russians aren't expecting you. They have got fortifications, but they're not fully mined and fortified in the way that the rest of the front line is. And they only have conscripts and border guards. And if you can have a surprise attack, then they aren't going to be expecting you. And you can take loads of land before they can get their act together and defend. So that's why they attacked into Kursk. And it was very, very sensible so to do. So if you're going to Rest Back Initiative, that's what you do. Okay, so they did that. They attacked into Kursk. They took huge amounts of land, relatively speaking, much more than they would have done in putting the same number of troops and the same amount of equipment into somewhere like, I don't know, Tabaivka or, I don't know, Konstantinivka or wherever it is, Vuhledar on the front line. Like, you put that amount of troops around those areas on the front line and you're just going to have massive pitched battles with the Russians, and you will grind some territory away from the Russians, but you will get attrited at massive levels. And we saw that in the counteroffensive in May 2023 at Malatok, Machka and other places on the front line, where they threw all of these resources into taking relatively little territory. We can see here that already it has been massively successful in taking territory. Now, what's happening now is that they are grinding to a much slower set of gains in the area. This is Andrew Perpetua's mapping, and bear in mind it will be conservative. I mean, let's go back to the 18th. This is now, what, 2 weeks ago? That's what it looked like. There were some big changes around then a load of less land around here and some more up the top. And then broadly, it stayed the same for the best part of 10 days. A little bit of change around this area where they're gaining a little bit, and consolidation in other places, but it hasn't particularly changed for some time. So now the Russians have got their act together. They're defending. They are using aviation. Apparently, they're leveling Sudzha. And the Russian mill blog has said, by the way, Russian civilians, you need to get out of Dodge because we're going to flatten places. The Russians are going to flatten places. So doing war, not like the Ukrainians did war when they took these areas. The Ukrainians took control and occupied all of these regions without doing too much damage. The Russians, to take it back, are going to flatten the places. And indeed, that's what they're doing in Sudzha. So the idea is, no, wrong one. Where is it? Yes, here. Russian forces are wiping out Kursk's Oblast Sudzha with bombs, according to the Ukrainian general. Russian troops are wiping out the Ukrainian captured town of Sudzha and Kursk, Russia's Kursk Oblast off the face of the earth, according to Alexander Pavlyuk, commander of the Ukrainian ground forces there. Russia is regularly shelling Sudzha and attacking it with guided aerial bombs and kamikaze drones, according to him. So that's what they're doing. And that goes back to the, would you rather have that happen on your land or Russian land? So they're taking the fight to Russia. They are forcing Russia to change their operations in a number of places. So we have heard that Kharkiv, the Russians have basically not taken any more land around there. It is really dropped off there as they've moved troops from Kharkiv to Kursk. We have heard certain other areas like Chaziv Yar has stopped. This was one of the main areas of Russian attack, and they have not made any gains there for a considerable period of time. So this is Chaziv Yar over the last 2 weeks. Absolutely no change to the front line. That's the 7th of August, and now that's almost a month of no change, right? Incredible. So that has stalled. Certain areas on the southern front line, apparently they've taken troops from Zaporizhia, from Kherson as well. Okay, so there is an effect of attacking Kursk and drawing Russian troops. So one of the objectives is not just going to be taking territory, not having our own forces attriting opposition forces and taking some logistical targets, but it's also going to be drawing troops away from other areas of the front line. And this is what wresting back the initiative looks like. So we are forcing the Russians to react to what we are doing. So that will hopefully cause the Russians to pull troops from Pokrovsk away from there to stop them having success in this area, neck of the woods. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because the Russians did pull troops away from a number of places. They have calmed down, but they didn't pull troops away from Pokrovsk and even arguably down towards Vuhledar in this area down here, where they're having some success. So the Russians, knowing that they're succeeding in a couple of these places, and that may well have been as a result of opportunistic gains, particularly Toretsk and New York, where I don't think they were expecting to make these gains. They used some tunnels, they attacked during some Ukrainian rotations, and the Ukrainians sort of capitulated to some degree, and the Russians opportunistically took some ground and were like, well, hey, let's do this. We've got a weakness here, let's all pile in. It's a shame because actually that really shouldn't have happened. But nonetheless, the Russians have been succeeding here, here, and here. And these are areas where the Russians are not taking too many troops away from. And for understandable reasons, because they realise that this is where they're succeeding. If they move troops from Pokrovsk and other such places and bring them to Kursk, then the Ukrainians will have succeeded in all of their objectives of Kursk. So the Russians are going to throw everything in their kitchen sink at these areas while taking away from other areas. And that appears to be what is happening. Although there are other areas where there are little bits of success as well for the Russians too. But in the main, it looks now like it's this game of chicken where the Ukrainians are attacking into Kursk, hoping that the Russians will crumble in Pokrovsk. And the Russians are attacking in Pokrovsk and Vuhledar and Toretsk, and hoping the Ukrainians will crumble in Kursk as they pull troops out there to defend these other areas. So that's the game of chicken. That's a military chicken that I think is happening at the moment. And we're at this very crucial point where some Ukrainians are saying, hang on, we don't think it's worth it doing this attack up here. But you have other voices saying it is worth it. There are more gains coming from Kursk than there are losses in Pokrovsk. So although it's terrible in Pokrovsk, and let's compare the gains. So I showed you very little gains in the last 10 days plus in Kursk as the Ukrainians have ground to a halt there. But now let's look from the 18th of August onwards in Pokrovsk. Now this is a smaller area, so bear that in mind. Right, this is, I don't know, it's sort of half the size of the Kursk area. So you can get skewed by not understanding the scale differences there. Okay, But let's look at the changes here for the Russians, and they are making consistent gains every single day. So the gains being made here are consistent and daily, to the point where the Ukrainians appear to be pulling out of towns without putting up a fight, without putting up a significant fight. Now, the idea previously would have been, as long as you are ceding territory for a lot of Russian blood, that the Russians are getting attrited and being made to work for every square kilometer, every square meter, then that's fine. But we've got to a point in the Pokrovsk area where the Ukrainians are pulling back quite easily. This is then leading Russians themselves to question whether this is part of an overall plan that is luring the Russians into a trap, because why are they able to take this area so easily? And then you have ideas like this, which is, oh, sorry, wrong place, which is, yes, okay, over here. Sorry, trying to find out where I am. At this stage, the armed forces of Ukraine have about 8 to 10 brigades in reserve. That is 40 to 50,000 military personnel. The refusal to use reserves of the defense of Donbass indicates that the Ukrainian armed forces have fundamentally different, probably offensive plans, which are closely related to the use of aviation components. This allows a NATO command to fully deploy its offensive strategies. Okay. Now, first of all, as someone says, this is assuming the 8 to 10 brigades are intact and that they aren't for replenishment of other units, it's just general kind of rotation, and that they are fully equipped, etc., etc. So there's a lot of ifs and buts here. But one of the points being made is that the Ukrainians supposedly have quite a few reserves. Why are they not using them in Pokrovsk? And if they're not using them in Pokrovsk, it looks like the Ukrainians are fine with losing this territory, that it's part of the calculation. And so there are all these ifs and buts. Are they going to use them for an attack somewhere else, completely somewhere else, or luring the Russians into taking areas rather too quickly in the Pokrovsk direction and then cutting those Russian forces off? You know, what is going on? Or is this just bad decision making from the Ukrainians and they should have used those troops? Or is it that they're not ready, that they don't really have all of those troops ready to go? All of the above are possible and even plausible. What is going on with this game of chicken? Okay, right, Kursk region. So we understand that Sudzha is in a lot of trouble. According to preliminary information from Ukrainian sources, they've taken control over a number of villages, as Noel Reports often says, moving in some of these directions. And when we look at the map, say from Andrew Perpetua, this is conservative. There are some claims that the Ukrainians do control areas of land further than is indicated by most of the maps, and so on and so forth. So, you know, you can go and look at the finer details. The other thing that's going on in the Kursk region is that, as we can see from this new video published today or yesterday, the Ukrainian Air Force featured the Kursk-damaged bridge in Kursk Oblast of Russia and the submerged pontoon bridge near it, which appears to be underwater because it was targeted and damaged, not for disguised purposes. So the Ukrainians are hitting bridges systematically in the same region. Defmon says, I've lost track of the Russian pontoons over the same, but I know they don't last long, so I think this is a new one. They are relatively easy to build and relatively quick to build, and so it is a game of whack-a-mole with pontoon bridges. And the Russians are bringing quite a lot of engineering equipment from deep storage out to deal with this. OSINT Technical says Ukrainian forces destroyed another pontoon bridge over the same river in Kursk, further isolating Russian troops on the southern bank. Seen here, Ukrainian HIMARS launched Gimler's rocket detonates a bridge as it breaks apart and floats downstream. Additional footage of the destroyed pontoon bridge floating away. So this kind of stuff is happening fairly frequently. This particular pontoon bridge as a geolocation, actually I don't know, I don't use Andrew's map for geolocating too much, but let's put it in there. There we go. So that is, just to around Zvanoya. So another one near Zvanoya. We've had the bridge at Zvanoya. We've had pontoon bridge hit there. There's, as you can see, Andrew Perpetua's actually got it. Another pontoon bridge taken out there. Then we have another bridge. We've had actually other pontoon bridges hit, but I don't think they're registered on there. So it could be that the Ukrainians have got some big intentions on this whole area south of Sejm, and that wouldn't surprise me. I'd hope that is the case, but it is becoming much more positional and grinding. We'll see how that turns out. Anyway, there you go. So that's some information on the pontoon bridges in Kursk, and just a few other nuggets. According to the channel of the Ukrainian Special Forces Unit Extreme Tourism Company, the offensive in Kursk was driven by several factors, including Sersky's desire to demonstrate a victory. So morale plays a big part in this. Taking a scare quotes victory back to the Ukrainian population gives them a sense, and there has been a real uptick in morale since they've attacked in Kursk. But now people are beginning to question whether that has been worth it in terms of what's going on in Pokrovsk. They also argue that redirecting these forces to Pokrovsk would only delay the inevitable. And Andrew Perpetua's sort of like this. It's not a personnel problem in Pokrovsk. It was fortifications, it was this, it was that, and actually throwing more people into that would only have sent people into a grinder that would have unfortunately not had the desired effect and would only have attrited troops at a much higher rate than they would have been attrited in Kursk. So the idea is that the Kursk the calculation here is that the gains in Kursk still outweigh the losses in Pokrovsk. And that is certainly true in terms of territory gain. So again, when we look at the dimensions here, we're going from one side to the other. That is 50. So that's 60 kilometers from that side, from kind of east to west. And depending on where you go from, it's somewhere around 30 kilometers north to south-ish, depending on where you pick your point. Okay, so 60 by 30. Give or take, it's a bit spiky. And then when we look at north to south here, we have 22. And east to west, we have, where are we going to? The other side of Avdiivka. And this is going back to October, so before Avdiivka was lost, 37. So 20 by 37. So this is a lot smaller than the Kursk area. So again, remember that. Now, Russia's response to the attack in Kursk region is already underway and will continue, says Peskov. Now, this is where you start getting strategic implications to Kursk. So we have heard that Russia has pulled troops from the Sahel region, Burkina Faso. The Bear Brigade has been brought from there. So that is an international strategy, security strategy, and geopolitical strategy for Russia that is being affected by that attack into Kursk. They're bringing people from Burkina Faso, possibly other areas of the Sahel. They are also bringing troops from all around Russia in terms of conscripts. This is affecting areas outside of just the Kursk region, outside of the entire Ukraine war. This is affecting personnel levels within Russia as a whole. So that's worth remembering as well. Okay, then we go on to Pokrovsk and have a little look at Pokrovsk and the challenges there. Russian blogger Podolyaka is surprised by the daily stupid attacks and waste of a lot of personnel and equipment in the Kurakova direction. So this is an incredibly important place, Kurakova. So you can I pronounce it in many different ways. So we have these attacks that are going in the westerly direction all along from Novomikhailivka here, going westwards. We have Mariinka going westwards towards Kurakova here. We have the move coming down south, seemingly towards Kurakova. So it could be that there are many, here around Vodyane as well, along this road area south of Konstantinivka towards Vuhledar. So you get all going westwards, and Kurakova seems to be one of the main targets there. But this guy is saying that actually he blames some generals for this, who he says really wants to be get the Hero of Russia award. He says the daily stupid attacks. Now there is a massive amount of degradation of Russian materiel here. 2 days in a row they lost sort of 30 bits of kit attacking in these directions. Today we hear 14 out of 16 bits of kit in was it the Pokrovsk area, or was that in the Kurakova direction? I can't quite remember, but anyway, it's that same general area. The Russians are taking territory, but they are losing an awful lot of equipment. Now, are the Ukrainians doing enough of a good job to attrit that equipment in the area? Are they being sidetracked by having ammunition and drones being sent to Kursk so that in the Pokrovsk direction, they are not able to bring enough equipment to bear against the Russians? That is a relevant question. An update in the Pokrovsk direction says no reports where Russia took over 2 villages, but now seems to have halted as new Ukrainian reinforcements have arrived. Interesting. Attacks on Seledove were repelled. So you've had this Seledove settlement that has been, it's a big old settlement that it looks like the Russians are just going to overwhelm, like they have done other larger settlements in the area. For example, the one just north of there called Novohradivka, where the Ukrainians didn't put up a fight and the Russians just took that really quite easily. While Seledove looks like the same kind of situation. However, it seems to have stabilized. It could be that the Ukrainians have brought enough reinforcements there. There's 2,000 National Guards from the Karadug offensive brigade that have been brought to bear in the Pokrovsk direction, so they could have stopped the Russians to some degree. Then you've got Vuhledar. This is video coming from Vuhledar today showing that it is being absolutely hammered, on fire again, being hammered by all sorts of ordnance. So you've got to worry that the Russians are sensing weakness all along this front, and Vuhledar itself. They could be attacking that from the north anytime soon. What are the Ukrainians going to do there? Are they going to have to pull back to a defensive line all the way back here? What's that say about the operational significance of this area? Will it have an effect on the strategy? We're going to come to that. Okay, so there is that. Now, just before we get onto some more bigger analyses, the UK intelligence says that Pokrovsk serves a key logistics hub for Donetsk Oblast, and if taken, is likely to lengthen and divert existing Ukrainian supply lines. This will likely make it more difficult for Ukrainian armed forces to resupply and maneuver resources quickly to several key strongholds between Chasiv Yar and Vuhledar. So this isn't, lots of people might call this a key strategic hub. It's not. It's a key operational hub. The operational tempo of military activity has remained low on all other front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine, with no major significant changes in territorial control because of what's going up in Kursk. Okay, so again, the question is this worth it? Are the losses in Pokrovsk worth the gains in Kursk? We are going to first of all look at what let's go to a slightly more negative appraisal by some journalists for the Telegraph with the Ukraine the latest, and the appraisal comes from Ukrainians themselves. The first thing to remember is, well, first of all, are there potentially these other reserves in force that the Ukrainians could use but aren't using? What's going on there? But also that even commanders in this area, but certainly troops in this area, are not going to be knowledgeable, cognizant of the overall strategies of what Zelensky and Sursky and the higher up commanders are intending with Kursk. And so if you ask commanders in Pokrovsk what's going on there, they are going to tell you how terrible it is in Pokrovsk, because they don't have enough ammunition, they don't have enough drones, they don't have enough people, right? Things are going badly there. And if they are not in the loop as to why Pokrovsk is not having the focus on it that they think it should, then they are going to spell doom for the Ukrainians in that area. They might not be aware that this is all part of a larger push and shove and a calculation whereby, yes, we are losing there, but we're gaining even more in Kursk. So remember that when we listen to, and this is a large excerpt, but I think it is, like I did yesterday with the with my geopolitics video where I played the whole Adam Kinzinger interview. This is a large segment that I think is absolutely necessary for you guys to hear.
What's behind this rather rapid advance of Russian forces? What can you tell us? What are the Ukrainians' sources sharing?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, me and a colleague here in Ukraine have been talking to civilians, talking to soldiers, talking to volunteers, just trying to get a picture of what's going on the ground there. And I think the bottom line is, it seems pretty difficult at this stage, given what we know, to separate what's going on in Donbass from what's happening in Kursk. It seems pretty clear. And again, it's early days. This is the first draft of history. There's probably a lot we don't know. But it seems pretty clear that the Russians did not take the bait in Kursk, refused to pull their troops from the Pokrovsk offensive to center Kursk. They've apparently taken quite a lot of troops from other parts of the front. But here they've doubled down. They seem to have decided to exploit basically a weakened front line with the absence of those kind of elite fighting troops that were put into the offensive up north in Russia. And the Ukrainians are really feeling it, to be absolutely honest. So this sense building in Pokrovsk itself, having spoken to people there, is that like the kind of rising tide of another Russian advance, another evacuation, everything that happens before the battle reaches a town that we've seen over and over again is well underway. And from the military point of view, I've been speaking to he's a battalion commander. I can't give his name, I can't give his unit, but if I just read out a little bit of what he said to us, I've never seen such speed. He's referring to in a Russian advance, square brackets in a Russian advance. It is very rapid, and our problem is the same. We don't have infantry, we don't have enough artillery or shells, and we don't have enough drones, which is another thing. So not enough FPV drones. And the Russians have, besides the large number of troops they've deployed there, he says they've deployed a lot of electronic warfare capabilities. That means the Ukrainians have to get 10, 12, 15 first-person drones up in the air just to destroy one tank, to get a hit. If one of them could take out one of the electronic warfare vehicles, that would make a difference. His estimate is that the Russians outnumber them, he thinks, 5-1 in terms of men. That is more or less borne out by the Centre for Defence Strategies, Ukrainian think tank, which put it at 4-1. So more or less the same kind of estimate, both from this officer on the ground fighting and from a fairly respectable Kyiv think tank. And essentially, very rapid advance. It looks like what's happened over the past few days is that the Ukrainians have stopped trying to fight for some towns and have begun to retreat. So we've seen, just let me pull up a map just here. So earlier this week, when I spoke to this officer, it was about 3 days ago, and he said, look, about 1/3 of Novokhodivka, that is a town on the railway line that leads up towards Pokrovsk, had been lost. We now understand the Ukrainians have basically pulled out the rest of that. That town is entirely believed to be under Russian control. Further north, on the north side of the salient, there's a place called where they're moving in, we've heard. And on the southern side of the salient, the Russians have moved into places like Memrik. We've got reports they pulled out of a place called Karlivka. So essentially what you're seeing is a rapid Russian advance, and there's no way of sugarcoating it. I think all the enlisted men, the officers on the ground, definitely believe that the Russian advance has sped up. A Ukrainian retreat, and we expect within the next few days, a few weeks, possibly, the Centre for Defence Strategies assumes that by mid-September, the Russians will be at Pokrovsk and fighting for it. Now, in terms of the big strategic kind of implications here, I think we've gone through it before, but just to reappraise why this is important, Pokrovsk is a transport hub. It's a relatively large town by Donbass standards, but it's also, you have 3 roads converging there and also a railway line, which makes it a really key kind of logistics support transport hub for the rest of the Ukrainian positions in Donbass, including,
I would say, 5 roads and a railway.
That fortress, Konobayasin, Konstantinovka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, which is to the northeast of here.
6 roads.
If it goes, that's going to make those logistics very difficult. But there's another problem, which is that you can see the Russians also expanding their salient to the north and the south. And if you look at it on the map, you'll see 2 kind of semicircular areas on either side of that are controlled by Ukraine. You can see very clearly that the Russians are hoping or trying to create essentially the threat to create 2 extra Ukrainian salients that they can then cut off or force the Ukrainians to retreat from. And so the upshot is, if Pokrovsk goes, it's not just Pokrovsk, it's probably a very large chunk of the remaining part of Donetsk region that the Ukrainians hold. It will definitely put more strain on Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Druzhkivka, and that will bring the Russians within another step, quite close to their stated goal of capturing all of the Donetsk region, but it also puts them in a position to threaten the Dnipro region and ultimately Dnipro itself. So it's a really grim, worrying situation. I just want to, before I pause, I'm just going to throw it forward a little bit, right? So there's 2 ways of looking at this. You could say either This is literally what it looks like, and this is the Ukrainian army, outnumbered, outgunned, completely exhausted, men who've been in trenches for months at a time without relief, or men who are raw and not used to being in combat and just can't stand up to this, just crumbling finally under the weight of the logic of Russian numbers, of being outnumbered and outgunned. Possibly that is what's going on. Possibly this is the final Ukrainian collapse of the line that the Russians have been hoping for. On the other hand, there are assessments that say, as Don was saying, that look, Pokrovsk is going to be much more difficult to take itself. It's a built-up area. So is Mirnahrad, and therefore a stand can be expected there. The Centre for Defence Strategy said that, okay, we think that the Russians will be at Pokrovsk by mid-September, but they're not going to capture it, and they'll culminate there. That will mark the peak of their advances this year. That's a hell of a prediction. You'll also have seen, David, on some of the pro-Russian Telegram channels, you can see some of the pro-war Russian commentators beginning to say things like, hold on a second, isn't this a little bit suspicious? How are we making such progress so quickly? Why aren't the Ukrainians trying to resist us? The implication there is, hold on a second, chaps, are we being lured into a trap? Anything is possible. The Ukrainian High Command and the Russian High Command know things that I don't, the Ukrainian soldiers don't, the Russian soldiers don't, and Russian bloggers don't. So who knows? But at the moment, if it's going to carry on the way it's carrying on, there's no way of sugarcoating it. It's very bad news for Ukraine at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for taking us through all of that. A couple of questions then. What's your reading of the criticism that we've been hearing from Ukrainian soldiers and some journalists, etc., of the Ukrainian political leadership of Zelensky? How serious is this Russian advance to the good relations between the president's office and the military? I mean, have you been hearing that from any soldiers or commanders about doubting maybe Zelensky's judgment, especially given the fact that the Ukrainians have gone into Kursk, and this is where, as we imagine, a lot of their very advanced kit and their hugely experienced soldiers are. And if this is, as you said, if this is starting to look like a bad move where you've got all of your best soldiers several hundred miles away in the wrong place where they're really needed in Donbass.
Well, there's definitely criticism out there. I mean, the officer we were speaking to didn't want to go there, but then our conversation was interrupted by a glide bomb. So he's still alive, as far as we know. But maybe we just didn't get to that part of the conversation. But others have been a lot more vocal. So this is Stanislav Aseyev, a Ukrainian journalist, now a soldier fighting on the Eastern Front. He basically says that Kursk was a good idea because it changed the calculus of the war. The Russians don't care about human losses, but they care about losing land. But Donbass was meant to buy time. Instead, here's his quote. He's put this on a Twitter thread just yesterday. We face the threat of destruction of the entire southern group of forces in the region, not just Pokrovsk. Why? A complex of internal regions, from planting flowers instead of fortifications to the lack of understanding on the part of the High Command of the problems that are clear to every soldier in the trenches. So you were talking there, David, about a divide between the army and the political leadership. I wonder if really the grievance is between people in the field and people, whether they're politicians or generals, back at headquarters. Because one of the complaints I've definitely heard, again and again, you remember that we were talking about the profile we wrote of Alexander Syrsky just a few days ago. One of the complaints that comes up is this just lack of understanding of what it is like, a sense of from guys down the front that, like, why am I being asked to do this, or why are we being ordered to do that? Don't you understand that, yes, okay, our unit on paper has 60% of its strength, but a lot of those guys are over 50, or they haven't been relieved for months. They've been under constant shelling, so on. Like, do you have any...
So, yes, there are issues of mobilisation. There are issues of force quality and force quantity. There are issues of fortifications, which seems to be something that's been bubbling under the surface for so very long.
Idea what it does to somebody's morale? Do you have any idea about the practical realities of what's going on and what we're being asked to do? That's definitely... That, I think, is a perennial thing in most wars, right? I mean, any time...
Yeah, and
any journalist...
I'm glad he said that, because that was going to be one of my points, is that this First World War, Second World War, these are always issues. Like, they don't understand when they're making these decisions up here, what's going on. Like I described to you the situation over in Krinky, where you had the people on the ground and it's horrible. The calculation's horrible. You are being used as bait to bring in the Russians, and there's only 300 of you there, but it's bringing in all these thousands of Russians and stupendous amounts of equipment, and then we can hammer that with our amazing Magyar's birds and artillery and so on and so forth. And so these guys were being used sacrificially. Now, if you're going to interview those guys and their commanders, they are going to be saying, well, this sucks. Why are we being sent to our suicide? Without understanding the larger the calculation that's taking place and the success of those people being there. Yet they weren't taking ground there, and this didn't become a meaningful bridgehead, but actually the attrition of the Russian equipment and personnel in this area was stupendous. Andrew Perpetua and his visually confirmed databases and what he said about this was exactly that. This was a real success for the Ukrainians here. But if you ask those people on the ground, or in many cases on those boats, they would not give you that opinion. So it depends who you talk to. These people don't have the knowledge of people further up the chain of command, and they don't understand the rationale necessarily. Sometimes they do, but many times they don't. So when you're asking people on the Pokrovsk front, this goes back to the point I was making earlier, you don't always get a full picture of, it might be terrible, it might be horrible, you might not have X, Y, and Z, you might, etc., etc. But it could be that actually the Ukrainian command know that. It's just part of their calculation. It sounds horrible, but actually they're okay with losing those people and that land because in a greater scheme of things, the advantage is far greater up here in Kursk than the disadvantage down here in Pokrovsk. Now, I think the question about fortifications is more pertinent, and I think there's a lot of blame that can be leveled at the Ukrainian command and government for not having sorted out fortifications behind Avdiivka ahead of a potential loss of Avdiivka. I don't think they were ever expecting to lose it, and so they didn't build those fortifications, but they did lose Avdiivka, and they didn't have the fortifications in place that should have been built around here. As a result, they had to be built much more quickly back here, and they are already becoming overwhelmed. So I think the fortifications question is certainly one that has there's a lot of merit in those questions and criticism.
The soldier knows, and probably all soldiers know, that nothing is ever their own fault. If something goes wrong, any soldier will tell you it was the generals, or it was the idiots in that unit down the line, or it was the sappers' fault, or whatever. But nonetheless, it's a criticism you hear, and not just from squaddies, right? You're talking about quite senior officers, but field officers down there who are quite angry. And of course, you've got also Mariana, just 2 seconds, Bezula, the MP who we were quoting, who's been critical of Sersky. We're talking about her in that article. I mean, she is quite an activist and has always been a bit of a thorn in the side of the military. But she put a post on Facebook just the other day saying she'd been down to Novokhrodiv and she'd found the trenches completely empty. She said there was basically no Ukrainian army in the city, that effectively trenches have been dug, but they've been abandoned for reasons she couldn't quite state. So yes, definitely, I think what's going on in Donbass is definitely causing tensions. You could see Volodymyr Zelensky getting testy about it. He was asked, I think it was Francis Farrell actually, friend of the podcast, asked him at a press conference the other day about this dichotomy between success in success in Kursk and looming defeat in Pokrovsk. And Zelensky rather testily said, well, was there a Russian advance towards Pokrovsk before Kursk? Yes, I think there was. In fact, I think they was going faster. Thank you very much. I don't think that's true. I think that's pretty difficult to square with what we've heard from people on the ground, which is that...
Yeah, it is. Defmon did an analysis the other day that it's doubled in pace since Kursk. So, that's not quite correct from Zelensky.
The Russian advance has definitely picked up in that time. But yes, absolutely. This is... What happens here is definitely going to colour relations between soldiers and headquarters, between the military and politicians, between the public and the political leadership as well.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. And just for listeners, we will put that link to the Kiev Independence video of Francis Farrell's question to Zelensky and Zelensky's response, so you can look at it and judge for yourself. I mean, I watched it, Roland, and I thought I hadn't seen Zelensky look quite so tired and worn as I had in that video. And I thought Francis Farrell put him on the spot. It was a fair question. And as you said, a rather testy response. Let's go then to our next guest, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon.
So Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a former tank commander in the UK Armed Forces that is now a contributor to Ukraine the Latest and writes quite widely in a number of publications. His initial response on the Kursk offensive is slightly different, maybe a tiny bit more upbeat.
Hamish, we've been chatting this morning and we've been sharing some of all the stories and the reportage from Kursk and Pokrovsk. Let's zoom out then. I mean, we've heard Dom's news, we've heard Roland's analysis. What's your take on what we're hearing?
Yeah, hi there, guys. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on
Apology that his audio is a bit rubbish.
again. Yeah, let me zoom out, as you say, and if I put my general's hat on here, absolutely are the two linked. I think interesting enough, and again, I'm being very dispassionate about this, so please forgive me. We look at the Kursk operation, which we all agree is a fantastic bit of manoeuvre warfare in the 21st century and has really shifted the dial. I think what it also shows is that both the Ukrainian High Command and the Russian High Command can only really operate at the sort of operational level, one major operation at the time, and one has allowed the other to happen. So while the Kursk operation has been the main effort, and you will have heard Dom and I talking about main efforts before, has been the main effort, the High Command in Ukraine, it has elicited all the sort of the expertise and advice. But what it also showed is that the Russian High Command, and we talked about their centralization of command and the fact that Putin gets involved in the lowest tactical decisions, makes it a very clunky organization, which is why we haven't yet seen any counterattacks into Kursk that one would have expected. So my look at Pokrovsk is, was it more of an opportunity? Did the Russian High Command think, crikey, there's a lot we can do about Kursk, but as Roland and Dom have identified, there's a bit of weakness here. So let's try and have an effect in Kursk by having a counter effect in the Pokrovsk area, and they seem to be throwing a lot behind it. But
so it is just the reverse of what the Kursk. So Kursk was like, we're trying to get troops away from Pokrovsk by attacking into Kursk, and then the Russians went, well, we've actually found weaknesses here. We can get troops away from Kursk by attacking into Pokrovsk. So it's like exactly the same rationale, but right back at the Ukrainians, and that's why I keep calling it this game of chicken.
In Kursk, we have a classic maneuver type operation, and down in the Donbass, it's still very much an infantry slog, as it were. But there's a good piece in the fellow broadsheet, The Times, today about phantom drone brigades. And although it's talking about how Ukraine managed to crack through at Kursk, it also goes on to say some of the maybe strategic objectives. I think I discussed last week about the sort of black swan events associated with Kursk, with refugees heading east and conscripts heading into the fight, and the fact that it is being talked about. So I think it'll be very interesting to see. And Roland said earlier that reports of troop build-ups in the Kursk area, whether Ukraine is going to try and extend the Kursk salient because of what's happening in the Donbass, that might well come about, or the sort of the citizens' army that they're signing up in Kursk, as we heard, is not going to be viable for some time, and certainly the Wagner troops from Africa are certainly not going to arrive in time. So an awful lot still to unfold there, I think. So to me, that it is a little bit of a counterbalance here, and it really, what happens next, I agree with Roland's assessment there. But I also, and as people have said, the concern that this has been a little too easy for the Russians on the face of it is a huge concern. But we've also seen the Ukrainians be pretty canny across the battlefield. So, and their operational security, their OPSEC, is exceptionally good, even on the transparent battlefield. So I don't think the Donbass piece is done, and I don't necessarily think the conclusion with a mass incursion is actually predestined. I think, again, probably to me, as a general, what happens in Kursk, because of the impact it's having on what's happening in Moscow, in the Kremlin at the moment, really will determine the longer term outcome of this. Over.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Another thing, if I...
Okay, so that's that. So what we're going to do is move on. Ben Hodges liked this piece from Phillips O'Brien. Phillips O'Brien has a new book out called The Strategist. But anyway, he's given his view on the abuse of the word strategic and how it pertains to what's going on both with this morning's or last night's massive drone attack into Russia, and also what's going on with Pokrovsk and Kursk. He talks about the abuse of the word strategic and what strategically important means, and looking at, so strategically important Pokrovsk, he says it's not strategically important, it's operationally important, and you don't smash up these words. Starting with the attack on Severodonetsk in 2022, the Russians have been said to have attacked and taken all of these strategic places, often just glorified towns, that have almost no ability to affect the long-term trajectory of the war. So he then talks about, Russian forces expand control of strategic cities, says the Wall Street Journal. Since then, the cities labelled strategic have grown exponentially to include Bakhmut, Avdiivka, New York, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk. These all come from some of the largest, most reputable and well-known media outlets in the West. So, Russia claimed a victory in the battle for the strategic Ukrainian town of Bakhmut. On the verge of losing Avdiivka, strategic city long targeted by Russia. Russian military says it takes control of strategic Ukrainian town, New York. Long battle for the ruined city takes a desperate turn. Ukrainian troops are engaged in a harsh struggle for Toretsk, a strategic city, says another. That's New York Times. So we've got Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, NPR. And then just down here, this is New York Times. And drones have offered last line of defense for a strategic Ukrainian town. That's Chasiv Yar. Okay. Phillips O'Brien says this borders on the irresponsible. Most of these towns were basically empty of population when fought over, had no working industry, etc. Some of them were so small to be hardly classified as towns. The idea that New York could be called strategic in any way is just a failure of education and an insult to the readers of the publications who are being told this. None of these places are anywhere close to being strategic importance. Severodonetsk, Bakhmut and Avdiivka were all taken by the Russians at enormous cost, and they made little or no impact on Ukraine's ability to prosecute the war. And that's kind of what strategic means. So will the loss of Pokrovsk cause Ukraine to adjust its strategy and to be unable to continue prosecuting the war? Not really. It's a town in the Donbass. Yeah, it's annoying and it's operationally significant, but strategically not so. But actually, Kursk, you could argue, has strategic impact by point of fact that it is affecting Russia's geopolitical strategy and pulling forces from around the world to here. It has internal implications with Moscow in terms of morale and PR and politics and information control and so on and so forth. There's an awful lot more implication to the attack into Kursk than the success of Pokrovsk. So when we're doing a calculation as to what's more useful, you can argue that Kursk has far more wide-ranging implications for Russia than Pokrovsk does for Ukraine. That is really bloody important. And so when you're saying how terrible it is down here, yes, it's terrible for those people and for those towns and for those villages and for those fields and that land. But the gains you get from Kursk, I think you can make a really successful argument that they far outstrip the losses in Pokrovsk. Okay? Right. So let's continue. So made little or no impact on Ukraine's ability to prosecute the war. These other so-called strategic cities or towns. They did not affect the number of soldiers Ukraine could raise and train and the amount of equipment that Ukraine could make or get from its allies, etc. However, this kind of labelling has impact. It creates an idea of a massive Russian steamroller taking whatever it wants, particularly places of strategic importance. Instead, what we have are some of the slowest, most destructive advances in modern military history, which is doing extraordinary damage to the forces making the advances. On the other hand, what is rarely labelled as strategic, or at least I struggle to find it, is the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk. And this is what I was just saying. I haven't read this bit yet. It's presented as a massive risk, one that is clearly backfiring on Ukraine as Russia presses ahead painfully slowly in what is considered an actual strategic area. In other words, the reporting and analysis of the war basically takes two areas of approximately equal size. Actually, Ukraine has probably seized more land, and said one is definitely of strategic importance and the other is not. So the reporting is that Kursk is not strategically important. It's just some kind of frivolous attack by the Ukrainians, and that Pokrovsk is strategically important. And Phillips O'Brien rightfully says that the opposite is true. Pokrovsk is not strategically important. It will not affect the way that Kiev prosecutes this war. But Kursk is strategically important and is a larger amount of land anyway. So it's so important. You could say that this is the underlying rationale of war reporting right now. And then it goes on, on and on. But as a bullet point list here, one, Ukraine has taken far more land than Russian forces since the summer of 2022. So if you include the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensives and the somewhat failed summer counteroffensive last year, and then what Russia has done, you add those all up or take one away from the other, Ukraine has taken more land than Russia since 2022. Or since summer 2022. Ukraine has the ability to organize and execute operations such as the Kursk offensive at a higher level than the Russians, such as during their Kharkiv offensive, barely visible on the map above. Ukraine has, so that's really important as well. So the Russians did a similar thing, but actually didn't take as much land, and it hasn't had a hugely strategic impact. Right, so that was just a small operational thing to do with Kharkiv, and even then, it didn't really succeed. So I long argued that failed as in its objectives, whereas Kursk has not, I would argue. 3, Ukraine has done this while being severely restricted by its partners in the systems it is given and how they can be used. 4, Russia's basically been able to use any system it wants in any way that it wants to try and achieve its aims. So Russia can do what it wants with whatever weapons it wants and fly those things into Ukraine and hammer civilian infrastructure and whatever. And yet Ukraine is unable to do the same back to Russia with the weapons they are providing. They have to create their own drones to fly them at these places, but they're not allowed to use missiles, and they're not allowed to use F-16s in the way or whatever in ways that they would really like. And still they are able to have the effect in Kursk that they have been. And that's really worth understanding. So he waxes, not waxes lyrical. He rages about the use of this phraseology in mainstream media pertaining to war and strategy, and then goes on to look at the advance in Pokrovsk and says you will soon be hearing about the strategic town of Kurk, as mentioned earlier, but it isn't. It's operationally significant. The pressure certainly seems extreme, as the Russians are reverting back to the kinds of human wave assaults that they were using in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Indeed, it is claimed that where Russia is sending most of its reserves, and yet the advances remain slow. They have picked up, and they are faster, I think, than possibly he admits. For all the talk of the Russians making much more in the way of advances since the Ukrainians started the Kursk offensive, it's worth putting that into perspective. The land taken by the Russians in the 25 days since the Kursk offensive is probably a little more than that taken in the 25 days before the offensive, but we are talking small number of kilometers. Yes, it's a smaller area than you might think, but actually it has doubled, but still, I get his point. If Ukraine had rushed all the troops they had to stop these meat assaults and mostly succeeded, the strategic situation would have been worse. This is what makes no sense in the attacks on Ukraine's decision to attack Kursk. It might have slowed the Russian attacks a little, but it would have forfeited the advantages the Ukrainians have accrued through the Kursk offensive. I agree. I still think the Kursk was definitely worth doing, and they've had success and they've had strategic impact, and they would not have had that impact had they put all of those troops into the Pokrovsk area. It's as simple as that. Totally agree with that analysis. Then it's also interesting to talk. He goes on to talk about the largest drone attack ever sent into Russia last night, and he finishes off because that has strategic impact. It affects energy production, it affects morale in the country, and it affects how they prosecute the war. If the Ukrainians do not have the ability to mass produce long-range systems that can threaten the power supply of large Russian cities such as Moscow, this will have strategic impact. It could cause a massive reorientation of Russian air defense or one. It could also put Putin in a real bind about what to do. His rule is based on the vision of strength and the fact that he has promised the Russian people that the war won't change their basic lifestyle. Now, we don't know If the Ukrainians have the capability to carry such a campaign off, though they are sounding confident, if they do it, it will truly be strategic, unlike the situation in New York. So what he's saying is what the Ukrainians are doing is truly strategic. So Kursk has a strategic impact. The attacks on the energy infrastructure and also the geographical positioning of those attacks around Moscow affects the morale, affects the way that Russia prosecute the war, what they do with their air defenses. And that's really significant. And the Ukrainians are doing that while under the cosh, while really under pressure. And this should not be overlooked. So the way this is being reported skews towards the doom and gloom of Pokrovsk. And you will find the troops and the commanders in that area talking about the doom and gloom and how terrible it is. But the big picture understanding of what's been going on and the calculation of this game of military chicken, I think needs to be better understood. And once you see the bigger picture, you understand that actually Kursk was a sensible option. And even though Pokrovsk is going badly, it's still more worthwhile to attack into Kursk with the troops that they did. So I do get that. And then when you add that together with the strikes and the oil refineries and the oil depots and the critical infrastructure that is being targeted by the Ukrainians, you have an attempt by the Ukrainians to wrest back the initiative. That's both a military initiative of where the Russians get their troops from to try and defend Kursk. And you also are taking the initiative away from the Russians in terms of striking Russia and getting the Russians to react to these strikes and pulling air defenses from possibly occupied territories in Ukraine to weaken the front lines there, to defend their critical infrastructure back in Russia, and then having to react to what the Ukrainians are doing rather than forcing the Ukrainians to react to what the Russians are doing. So that is really important to understand. Hopefully I've made sense. There's still many variables that are ongoing. There are still many calculations that are yet to be made. But as it stands at the moment, I think on balance that the Kursk offensive was a correct thing to do and is still reaping more benefits than it is causing costs. Let me know what you think down below. Sorry this was a long one, but I think it was important to talk about this. Take care. Speak soon.